Welcome, everybody. Welcome back to the interviews of the European Livestock Voice. Today we are speaking with Gbola Adesogan, is a professor from the University of Florida. Hi, Professor. How are you doing?
Fine, thank you. Thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you very much for your availability. It took a moment to get in touch again. We met in Dublin a few months ago, and I'm very grateful you are here with us today. Would you like to introduce yourself more appropriately?
Yes, thank you. I'm Gbola Adesogan. I'm an Associate Vice President and Professor here at the University of Florida, the Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences. I'm also the Director of the Global Food Systems Institute, and I've been directing the Bill and Melinda Gates and USAID funded Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Livestock Systems. I just stepped down as director. Thank you.
Well, thank you again. And I know that you have a global view on livestock and agriculture, and your experience are confirming that. So I'm asking you straight away regarding livestock and agriculture in general, I would say. So you work in the US, but you're from Nigeria originally. So what are the main differences between Nigeria and the US, or let's say in general, between Africa and the so-called Western world?
Okay. Thank you. And you mean in terms of livestock production?
Yes.
Yes, yes. So the biggest difference that I think a lot of us see is that most, but not all, of African farming systems, livestock production systems are far behind those in the West, those in Europe, those in the US. Some of them are, over 100 years behind in terms of the knowledge, in terms of the technology that is being used, in terms of the levels of production. I was talking to someone this morning, and we were discussing about how here in the US, the aim is to produce, we're looking for ways to increase milk production by 5 pounds, whereas in some of the African countries, we're trying to get to 5 pounds, or maybe to double it to 10 pounds. So that's in kilograms, that's just over 2 kilograms or 5 kilograms. So the production levels are much, much lower in the African countries, and that's because of inadequate feeding. It's because of breeds that are very adapted and resilient to the pests, diseases, and climate, but are less productive. It's because of management practices that do not optimize productivity, and it's also because of health challenges. So there are very, very big differences between US or Western and African livestock systems, or the majority of them. There are exceptions, of course. There are bigger and commercial farms in Africa that are much more like the Western farms, but by and large, those are the exception rather than the rule for most of Africa.
So it's basically a difference in terms of efficiency, let's say.
Correct. Productivity and efficiency, yes, that's right.
And despite that, I can tell you that there is a quite strong anti-meat, anti-livestock agenda going on in Europe, maybe in the US a touch less, I don't know, or in some parts of the US at least. But in Europe, despite the, let's say, high efficiency in production, the sector is pretty much under attack, let's say. And again, because of your broad view of this sector, I ask you, in your opinion, why is this, let me call it, anti-livestock agenda so strong nowadays in Europe and partially in the US?
Yeah, I think one of the main reasons is the environment. And a lot of this dates back to a publication that came out, I think it was 2006, that said that the emissions from the livestock sector were greater than those from the automotive or the car sector. And unfortunately, that was misleading information, and the authors have retracted and corrected it, but that correction has not received as much traction as the original information. And so consequently, there is this impression that livestock production is a bigger contributor to greenhouse gas emissions than some of the other industries. Now, don't get me wrong, livestock do emit and do emit significantly, and we should and we are doing things to curtail those emissions. But the initial information about the emissions relative to that from the livestock sector, I think just got a lot of people so concerned. And I think that has just snowballed after that. So let me stop there for now. Yeah.
No, I know what you're talking about. Let's say that this study about the long shadow of livestock is still pretty present on the media. Let's say, but there are many groups which are still diffusing this data, even if, as you have said, the authors retracted that pretty soon after that. And this study, there are still NGOs, I tell you, in Europe, in Italy for sure, that are stating that livestock is emitting more than transport still nowadays. So we still have the effects, so you can imagine. And all these, as you said, takes many people to have a pretty strong opinion against livestock, often undeserved. As you have said, again, I completely agree. It doesn't mean that livestock is not emitting or that nothing like that, but we should start to inform a bit more appropriately, and that's why I'm happy to ask your opinion and to use your expertise about these things. But all this took also many people in Europe, at least, to say that we should veganize Africa and all these kind of things. I've seen myself that in sub-Saharan Africa, this subject is not really taken well by most of the people, fortunately. But objectively, there is a problem of malnutrition still in many parts of Africa. And I ask you, again, focusing on livestock and animal source foods, what are the malnutrition risks for African people and children in particular from your point of view, of course?
So this is a very good point. Let me start from the US and then go to Africa. So some of my colleagues published a paper some years ago where they were looking at what would happen if we remove all livestock from the US. How would that affect emissions, and how would that affect health? And what was discovered was that the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions as a result of removing all livestock was only about, I think in methane emissions, was only about 2%. So it wasn't as significant as many people would have anticipated. But what they discovered was that many of the people in the US would be plagued with a lot of diseases that we used to hear of in the history books associated with nutrient deficiencies in the diet. So there are so many of these, there are a number of these different diseases, and they said they'll become so much prevalent. And the reason why is because livestock products, meat, milk, eggs, contain an assembly, several different important micronutrients. And it's not just the concentration of micronutrients in these products that's important. It's how bioavailable they are. So they are much more readily supplied. Plants have these same micronutrients, but in large part, they are bound up, so they are not as readily available for absorption in the body. And so what they had, this was the finding from that study. Now, in many of the African contexts, people are almost vegan or vegetarian, not by choice, but by economic circumstances. because they have not been able to afford livestock products because they have taboos that limit or livestock product consumption. What ends up happening is that many of the people in the rural areas, particularly the women, the children, the infants, especially the pregnant and nursing mothers, are deficient in these important micronutrients. And so there are three significant nutritional problems that result. There is stunting, which is when a child fails to achieve their height potential. There's wasting, and there's underweight. And globally, I think about 144 million children under 5 are stunted. And this metric is very important because stunting is not just a measure of growth, or it's a measure of cognitive impairment. In the first 1,000 days of life, these micronutrients are very important for proper brain formation, for proper cognition. Several of these important micronutrients, zinc, iron, vitamin B12, and so on and so forth, are really important for proper formation of the brain and for those early processes, for developing the neurons, which are so vital in our cognition. And when these micronutrients are lacking, then you have malformation of those elements. And consequently, the children develop problems with their cognition. They're not able to do well in school. They're not able to do well in society because of that compromised nutrition early in life. And one of the studies that sought to understand how important these micronutrients are, they had a simple approach. They just added a little bit of meat or milk to the diets of school children in Kenya. And what they found was that adding a matchbox size of meat to the basal diet, which was beans and corn, so they were having a legume and they were having a cereal. Beans and corn was the basal diet. A matchbox size of meat increased the exam scores of these 7 to 10-year-olds across all subjects. So the increase was 45% across all subjects over several different school semesters. So that was very striking, and adding milk to their diet increased their performance by, I think it was 28%. So there have been other studies that have shown that these micronutrients and from animal source foods are not just important for growth, but for cognition. There was a study in Ecuador that just looked at feeding an egg a day to infants and showed that stunting was reduced by a huge percentage. I think it was about, I need to look at the exact statistic, but I think it was at least 40%, but it was the biggest reduction on record.
Wow.
And so these animal source foods are very important. We've also started looking at this area, and some of our early work is showing that animal source foods are very important for cognition. We looked at over 10,000 children in several different countries and whether adding meat to their diet improved measures of cognition or not. And we found that in more than half of these children, there was an improvement. And in fact, in those where there was no improvement, where there was a decrease in cognition, those children had HIV as well. So that was a confounding factor.
It's pretty impressive. Do you think that, because this is pretty striking. Because in the West, let's say in Europe again, in particular, probably in the US a touch less, they're promoting a lot plant-based diets, and they're still saying that you can substitute animal source foods with plant-based stuff, which is often not true because, as you have said, the nutritional properties are not the same. But now it's a recent the recent news about Edinburgh in Scotland choosing to ban animal food from the canteens. Basically, every public canteen, like also including the school ones. Or in my city, Milan, they're pushing to have veggie menus in the schools. Do you think that that could be impacting our society? Of course, it's not the same situation like in Africa. I mean, you can eat everything. It's a choice. I mean, there are many big differences. But are you not thinking that that could be impacting Western society?
You know, everybody is entitled to their opinion and their dietary preference, whether they want to be a vegan, a meat eater, or vegetarian. But the issue is that we should allow people to be able to choose. It's much more complex and difficult and challenging to be able to maintain a vegan diet than it is to maintain a diet that's based on meat, from a standpoint of getting those vital micronutrients that are important for cognition and well-being and so on. So in Western countries, it is possible, you know, using different supplements that you can get. It's more challenging. I did hear of a study, a case in one of the European countries where some parents wanted their children to become vegans, and the government took the parents to court because it's very challenging to consistently consume a balanced diet. If you're a vegetarian and if you're a child, then, you know, as our children are, they have different, you know, preferences, and they may not be as diligent as is necessary to get all those micronutrients. So it is a challenge. It is something that I think we have to watch out for. I heard that in some of the European countries, there are some of the issues, micronutrient deficiency syndromes that we had long forgotten, showing up again, like, you know, rickets,
yeah,
and so on. So that is partly due to, you know, lack of sunshine, but also some of these animal source foods are good sources of the missing micronutrients.
Well, I could go on talking with you for hours, but I don't want to take too much of your time. And no, thank you very much for sharing also your views, your experiences, and these informations you have given. And I will personally go to check out much better these studies you were talking about, because I think it's an important matter. And so, Professor, I hope we can get in touch again soon, because I'm sure we have many things to talk about. And for the time being, again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Really appreciate the opportunity.